He spent years walking through some of the most remote wilderness in North America, cameras rolling, searching for something most scientists refused to take seriously. And then, almost without warning, the show ended. The question nobody fully answered was what happened to James Bobo Fay after the cameras stopped. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what we found goes well beyond a television cancellation. To understand Bobo Fay, you have to understand the world he operated in, not just the cultural world of cryptozoology and cable television, but the physical world, the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, the Oregon Cascades, the dense timber belts of the Appalachian Corridor. These are not metaphorical wildernesses. These are places where the canopy closes so thick that satellite imagery struggles to resolve the ground beneath it, where ridge systems run for 40, 50, 60 miles without a paved road crossing them, where the annual rainfall in certain valleys exceeds 120 inches, where black bear populations are dense enough that the average hiker never sees one because the animals hear you coming long before you arrive. This matters because it is the specific context in which Bobo Fay built his entire adult identity, and it is the terrain that shaped his credibility among a community that spends its time in exactly these places. James Fay was born in 1963. He grew up in the Boston area, which might surprise people who associate him entirely with Northern California. His path to the Pacific Northwest was not a straight line. He attended the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he competed as a water polo player at a high level and developed the physical conditioning that would later define his fieldwork. He was large, strong, and genuinely comfortable with physical discomfort in the outdoors. These were not television affectations. People who knew him before finding Bigfoot have consistently described a man who was already living a fairly unconventional outdoor life before any production company came calling. He settled in Willow Creek, California. That location is specific and it matters. Willow Creek sits at the edge of the Trinity Alps and the Six Rivers National Forest. It calls itself the Bigfoot capital of the world, and it has done so for decades. The Patterson-Gimlin film, arguably the most analyzed piece of alleged Bigfoot evidence in the world, was shot in 1967 at Bluff Creek, which is approximately 38 miles northeast of Willow Creek. So Bobo Fay did not move to a random rural town. He moved to the center of gravity of American Bigfoot research and embedded himself there for years before Finding Bigfoot premiered in 2011. Finding Bigfoot ran on Animal Planet for 9 seasons. 9 seasons. That is a significant television run by any standard, not just for a show operating in a niche that many television executives would have dismissed after 1 or 2 seasons of low ratings. The show premiered on May 15, 2011, and it ran until May 22, 2016. Over those 5 years, the core team of Matt Moneymaker, Cliff Barackman, James Bobo Fay, and Renee Holland traveled to dozens of states, multiple countries, and logged hundreds of hours in the field across episodes that consistently drew somewhere between 1 and 2 million viewers per episode during its peak years. Bobo Fay's specific role on the show was well defined. He was the field guy, the one who would wade into the darkest corner of whatever forest they were investigating and stay there. He was the one who would lie down next to a cast footprint to provide scale for the camera, using his own 6'4" frame as the reference point. The show used this technique so consistently that it became almost a signature. A long, wide shot of a forest, a plaster cast in the dirt, and Bobo Fay stretched out beside it to demonstrate just how large the print was relative to a large adult male. It was effective television, and it was also, in its own way, a genuine investigative method. Scale matters in physical evidence analysis. The show ended without a dramatic finale. There was no on-air announcement of cancellation, no special retrospective episode, no reunion. It simply stopped. The final episode aired and that was it. For a show that had accumulated a dedicated audience across 9 seasons, the absence of a formal conclusion struck many viewers as abrupt. Animal Planet did not make extensive public statements about why the show ended when it did. Industry observers noted that the network was in the middle of a broader programming shift, moving away from the naturalistic and mystery-focused documentary style that had defined much of its output in the early 2010s. The cancellation was part of a wider pattern rather than a specific judgment about Finding Bigfoot's performance. But the more interesting question was always about the people. Specifically, what did Bobo Fay do when the structure of weekly television production was no longer organizing his life? The answer, at least initially, was that he did not dramatically change course. This is actually one of the most telling details. Many television personalities, when their show ends, pivot hard. They move into social media, they launch podcasts, they write books, they pursue speaking circuits. Bobo Fay did some of these things, but his pivot was much quieter and much more aligned with his pre-television identity. He went back to doing what he had been doing before the cameras arrived: field research. Witness interviews. Time in the woods. In the years immediately following the show's end, Fay continued attending and speaking at Bigfoot conferences. The Sasquatch Summit, held annually in the Pacific Northwest, was one venue where he remained a regular presence. He also remained connected to the broader BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, which is the group that Matt Moneymaker founded and which has served as the institutional backbone of the Finding Bigfoot team's work, both on and off camera. Fay's continued involvement with the BFRO after the show ended was not incidental. It reflected the fact that his commitment to the subject had never been primarily televisual. He gave interviews to regional outlets and to podcasts that cover the cryptozoology space. In these interviews, which accumulated in the years from 2016 through 2021, Fay was consistent on several key points. He maintained that he had encountered evidence that he found personally convincing. He was careful, usually, to distinguish between what he could state as fact and what remained inference. He acknowledged the frustration of 9 seasons of television without a definitive discovery. He did not pretend the show had ended with the answer it was looking for. He was also candid about the financial realities of life as a Bigfoot researcher outside of television. Willow Creek is a small town with a limited local economy. Before finding Bigfoot, Fay had supported himself through a variety of means, including commercial fishing in Alaska, which he returned to in the years after the show. Commercial fishing in Alaska is hard and specific work. It is seasonal, physically demanding, and lucrative enough on a per-season basis to support a modest life if you are willing to do it year after year. The image of a former television personality heading back to an Alaskan fishing boat is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something real about the gap between television celebrity and the economic realities of people who inhabit it. He also continued doing what he called public outreach, which in practice meant showing up at events where people wanted to talk about Bigfoot and actually talking with them in depth, without condescension. This was something people who attended these events consistently noted. Fay was not performative about it. He would sit with witnesses and listen to their accounts with the same attentiveness in 2018 that he had demonstrated in 2011 when a production budget was attached to every conversation. In 2019, Fay gave an extended interview to a regional outlet in Northern California in which he discussed what he described as a significant personal encounter from his years in the field, one that he said had not been fully captured or conveyed on television. He described a night in the Six Rivers National Forest, in a drainage he declined to specify precisely, in which he heard vocalizations that he said were unlike anything in his extensive experience of that forest. He had been in that forest for decades at that point. He knew the sound profile of that terrain. He was not describing excitement. He was describing something that he said had genuinely unsettled him. He did not claim to have seen anything. He was precise about that distinction. Sound, not sight. Evidence of presence, not visual confirmation. This is actually a meaningful distinction in the framework that serious Bigfoot researchers use. Auditory evidence is one category. Physical trace evidence, meaning footprints, hair samples, tree structures, is another. Visual sighting is the third and by far the most contested. Bobo Fay, throughout his career both on and off television, tended to be more restrained about visual sightings than his on-screen persona sometimes suggested. The show needed dramatic moments. The research itself was more methodical and less theatrical. By 2020, Fay had developed a more substantial social media presence, largely on Facebook, where he connected with witnesses and researchers. This was less about building an audience and more about maintaining a network. The Bigfoot research community is genuinely community-like in its structure. There are long-term relationships, running debates, shared databases of sighting reports, and a significant amount of interpersonal drama of the kind you find in any subculture organized around an unresolved question. Fay operated somewhere near the center of this network by virtue of his television visibility, but he was not trying to monetize that position aggressively. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 did something interesting to the Bigfoot research world more broadly, and Fay's trajectory reflected this. With outdoor recreation surging and people spending more time in forests and wild areas, the volume of reported sightings increased noticeably. The BFRO's database, which is one of the largest repositories of Bigfoot encounter reports in existence, received a higher volume of submissions during this period. Fay was one of the people involved in processing and investigating some of these reports, not as a television exercise, but as an ongoing research practice. He also became more vocal during this period about his views on the scientific establishment's treatment of the subject. This is a shift worth noting. In the Finding Bigfoot era, the show was careful to maintain a kind of respectful neutrality toward mainstream science, even while pursuing a hypothesis that most mainstream scientists dismissed. Fay post-television was somewhat less diplomatically neutral. In multiple interviews between 2020 and 2023, he argued that the dismissal of Sasquatch evidence by academic zoologists and anthropologists was not a neutral scientific judgment, but a social and professional one. That researchers who took the subject seriously faced genuine career consequences, and that this had distorted the academic record in ways that were not strictly about the evidence. He was not wrong that career pressure shapes research priorities. That is a documented phenomenon in institutional science. He was applying it to a specific case in which he had an obvious personal investment, which complicated the argument but did not necessarily invalidate it. He pointed specifically to the question of hair and tissue samples. Over the decades of formal Bigfoot research, samples have been submitted to genetic analysis on multiple occasions. The results have consistently either shown known species, most often bear or human, or degraded samples insufficient for typing. No sample has produced a novel primate profile. Fay's position on this, stated clearly in several contexts, was that the sampling methodology itself was flawed. That many of the samples analyzed came from collection procedures that were not rigorous enough to prevent contamination, and that the chain of custody from forest floor to laboratory was often inadequate. He cited specific cases where he believed collection had been done properly and results had been less definitive than the published summary suggested. This is a specific technical claim, and it is one that is genuinely difficult to evaluate from the outside, which may be part of the reason it circulates in the research community without resolution. His relationship with Cliff Barackman, his co-investigator from the show, remained visible and apparently warm. Barackman, who operates the North American Bigfoot Center in Boring, Oregon, has continued to be one of the more publicly active figures in the post-finding Bigfoot landscape. The two appeared together at events periodically, and Barackman spoke positively about Fay in public contexts on multiple occasions. The relationship between the two men was substantively different from the relationship between Fay and Matt Moneymaker, which was more professionally focused, or the relationship between Fay and Ronnie Holland, which was marked on screen by a genuine and recurring philosophical disagreement. Holland, a wildlife biologist, maintained a skeptical position throughout the show's run, and that disagreement was not performative. It was real. Post-show, Holland largely stepped back from the Bigfoot world, which is its own significant data point about what the experience of finding Bigfoot meant to different members of the team. Fay's public statements about Holland in the post-show period were consistently respectful. He acknowledged that her skepticism had served a legitimate function within the show's structure. He said, in a 2018 interview, that having someone on the team who pushed back forced everyone to be more rigorous about what they were claiming. Whether this represented his genuine view or a diplomatic framing of a difficult professional relationship is impossible to say from the outside. By 2022, Fay had begun appearing in other productions in a limited capacity, not as a lead, but as a contributor or subject. Several documentary series and streaming productions covering the broader cryptozoology space or the history of Bigfoot research featured him in interview segments. He was comfortable on camera, still physically imposing, still carrying the same unhurried confidence that had made him effective television a decade earlier. These appearances were not comeback attempts. They read more like a veteran subject matter expert doing what veterans do, providing context and continuity to productions made by people who weren't there in the early years. He was also candid in these later appearances about the psychological cost of years of inconclusive searching. This is something that rarely gets discussed in the context of reality television. The people who do this work, especially the ones who take it seriously, are accumulating experiences that don't resolve. Every expedition that doesn't find definitive proof is a trip into cognitive uncertainty. You hear something, you find something, you experience something that your senses tell you is significant, and then you come home with audio recordings that experts attribute to known species, or plaster casts that may or may not show dermal ridges, or nothing at all. Fay described this experience not with bitterness, but with something that sounded more like acceptance. He said in a 2021 podcast interview that the not knowing was something he had made his peace with over a long time, that the search itself had value, regardless of where it ended. Now here is what most of the coverage of Bobo Fay missed, and this is the pivot that matters. The narrative around him after finding Bigfoot tended to frame his continued fieldwork as either admirable dedication or slightly sad persistence, depending on the bias of whoever was writing. Both framings missed something important. Fay's ongoing work was not primarily about proving anything to a skeptical public. It was about building and maintaining a specific kind of community archive. The witness interviews he continued conducting, the expedition reports he continued filing with the BFRO, the mentorship he provided to younger researchers entering the field, all of this represented a sustained and systematic effort to create a documented record of human experience in remote wilderness across decades. Whether or not that record ever yields a specimen that satisfies a peer-reviewed zoological standard, it constitutes something. It is a longitudinal account of what people have reported encountering in specific geographic areas across a span of time. Historians and anthropologists have occasionally noted that witness testimony databases, even about subjects that remain scientifically contested, have analytical value for understanding human perception, environmental psychology, and the relationship between rural communities and the wild spaces they live adjacent to. Fay was not making this argument himself, at least not in these terms, but it is the argument that makes sense of what he was actually doing with his time after the cameras stopped. He also became more involved in land access advocacy in a quieter way. The logging industry, road closures, and shifting federal management priorities in national forest lands have progressively restricted access to some of the most historically active areas for Bigfoot research over the years. Fay understood this as an issue not just for researchers, but for the broader category of people who use remote public lands: hikers, hunters, tribal members, naturalists of every kind. His advocacy here was informal rather than organized, but it was consistent with a lifelong orientation toward wild places as genuinely important and worth protecting. His health became a subject of some discussion in the community during the early 2020s. Years of commercial fishing, decades of fieldwork in wet, cold, steep terrain, and the general accumulation of physical miles on a large frame take a toll. Fay was not hiding this. He mentioned in several interviews that he had dealt with joint issues that were the predictable result of a life lived the way he had lived it. He was not dramatic about it. He was matter-of-fact in a way that suggested someone who had accepted the physical consequences of specific choices rather than someone who regretted those choices. The community response to these disclosures was notable. The Bigfoot research world is, in many ways, built on the credibility of its most prominent field investigators. When the person who spent decades in the woods tells you his body is showing the wear of that work, it reinforces the claim that the work was real. This is different from a television personality saying they worked hard. Fay's physical condition was documentation in a way that is specific to people who actually do difficult outdoor work over long periods. By 2023 and into 2024, Fay had developed what could reasonably be described as an elder statesman role within the Bigfoot research community. Not retired, not inactive, but occupying a different position than he had in the height of the television years. He was the person newer researchers sought out for context. He had direct field experience in locations that had been active for decades and that newer investigators were working to understand. He had witnessed the evolution of the technology used in field research, from plaster casting and audio recording to thermal imaging, environmental DNA sampling, and drone-assisted surveys. He had opinions about all of it, usually grounded and specific rather than abstract. He was also one of the people willing to say clearly that 9 seasons of finding Bigfoot had not produced the evidence the show was looking for. This is a more honest position than the one that some participants in similar investigations adopt, which is to continuously reframe what has been found as more significant than it is in order to maintain the premise. Fay's willingness to acknowledge the limits of what the television work had achieved, without abandoning his underlying belief that the subject deserved investigation, was a position that required more intellectual honesty than the simpler alternatives in either direction. The simpler alternatives were, on one side, to declare that finding Bigfoot had proven nothing and that Bobo Fay had wasted decades on a fantasy. On the other side, to double down on every piece of ambiguous evidence as confirmation. Fay consistently refused both of these framings. He held a position that is genuinely difficult to maintain, which is that the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, that the research continues to be worth doing, and that the absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence in a landscape as vast and as undersurveyed as the one he spent his life working in. That last point has independent scientific validity. The identification of new large mammal species in the 21st century has continued at a pace that surprises non-specialists. The saola, a large forest-dwelling bovine in Vietnam, was not known to science until 1992, and even then it took years of fieldwork to document properly. The Tapanuli orangutan, a distinct orangutan species, was not formally described until 2017. These were not small animals in remote oceanic islands. They were large mammals in regions that had been inhabited by humans for millennia. The argument that North America is too well surveyed for a large primate to remain undescribed is weaker than its mainstream acceptance might suggest, especially given how much of the most relevant terrain in the Pacific Northwest and the broader Mountain West is genuinely difficult to survey. Fay made this argument, repeatedly, with specific reference to the topography of the areas where sightings were concentrated. He would describe the drainages, the elevation ranges, the seasonal movement patterns that witnesses reported, and layer them against what he knew about the terrain from years of direct experience. It was not the argument of someone looking for a comfortable belief. It was the argument of someone who had spent a significant fraction of his adult life in the specific places being discussed. What is still open, after all of this, is the question that has always been at the center of James Fay's life work. The evidence base for Bigfoot remains what it was: large, anecdotal, geographically distributed, and without a type specimen. No body, no bone fragment, no unambiguous genetic sample. The physical evidence that exists, the footprint casts, the recordings, the blurry photographs and videos, remains genuinely ambiguous. The most charitable interpretation does not close the case. The most skeptical interpretation does not eliminate all of the data points. What the end of Finding Bigfoot did eliminate was the possibility that a cable television production model was going to be the mechanism by which the question was resolved. That was never a realistic mechanism anyway. Field research designed primarily around broadcast schedules and dramatic payoffs is not the methodology that produces rigorous scientific findings. Fay understood this while he was doing it, and he has been clear about it afterward. What remains open is the possibility that the witness testimony database, the improved environmental DNA sampling technology, the increasingly accessible thermal and acoustic sensing equipment, and the continued work of people like Fay who have decades of site-specific knowledge might eventually produce something that forces a different kind of conversation. Not a television conversation, a scientific one. James Fay, as of the time this script was written in mid-2026, remained active in the research community, maintained his connection to the Northern California terrain that had been the center of his field work for decades, and had not abandoned the project that has defined his adult life. He had not found Bigfoot. He had also not stopped looking, and in the specific landscape he operates in, where the forest closes over and the ridgelines run for 50 miles without a road, and where the animal he is searching for has been reported by credible witnesses for over a century, the absence of a final answer is not, at least to him, the same thing as a final answer. That distinction is either the foundation of a life's work or the most expensive self-deception in the history of wildlife research. After everything, that question remains genuinely open.